want to give you a brief overview of what's happening in the Amazon, what we're doing to address these problems, and how ultimately I think we could be victorious. But at the outset, I want to state that I'm an ethnobotanist. An ethnobotanist is a scientist who studies how indigenous peoples interact with plant environments, very often in the Amazon with medicinal plants. So one of the obsessions of ethnobotanists is curare, arrow poison. This is something used as a deadly poison by indigenous peoples, which becomes a life-saving medication in Western medicine. So a few years ago, I'd come back from the Amazon with the Holy Grail, which were arrows with a new kind of arrow poison, and I was mounting them on the wall of my office, and this friend of mine wandered in and said, "Are those poison-tipped arrows?" And I said, "Yes," very proudly, and he says, "Well, don't you think that's like kind of dangerous?" And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, don't you worry about the fact that people could like stick their fingers on it, wondering if it's still toxic?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I mean, I'll come in every morning and there'll be a pile of dead, stupid people." But it's like natural selection by ethnobotany, so it didn't worry me too much. Now, what I want to do is take you into the rainforest of the Amazon and show you what's going on the ground. We all know about these terrible fires, and looking at this very complex graphic, and I'll leave some of these graphics behind so you can look at it at your leisure. The most important thing to notice is that 74,000 fires have been recorded in the Amazon in the last year. This is a terrible situation, and it's getting worse. What's important to note about this incredibly indecipherable graphic is that most of the fires are happening in the south. And they're not only in the rainforests of the Amazon, but southwest into some of the drier rainforest regions like the Chaco in Paraguay and Bolivia, and some of these countries that are on the border with Brazil. So terrible scenes like these are becoming increasingly common, and left behind is a wasteland with nothing remaining. Now, to some of the cattle ranchers, this is what they're looking for, because the nutrients have been released into the soil and you can start producing cattle. But to those of us who love and cherish nature and the indigenous peoples that are allied to her, this is quite the catastrophe. And one of the undertold stories of this terrible situation is the impact on indigenous peoples. This is actually an indigenous roundhouse, a maloca in the lower right-hand corner, which is burning. And so these indigenous peoples who are paying the price are actually left with nothing. And one of our priorities at the Amazon Conservation Team, and Brian is really the point person for that, is that of protecting isolated, so-called uncontacted peoples and their rainforests. In the course of our work, we've identified what we think is about 70 tribes of isolated or uncontacted peoples in the Amazon, most of which are clumped in the northwest Amazon, where Peru, Colombia, and Brazil come together. So if you're interested in more information on this particular topic, I encourage you to look at my TED Talk on how to protect the uncontacted tribes of the Amazon. The untold story again about these isolated peoples in these fires, as many as 33 of these 70 groups may be menaced by fires encroaching on their lands, most of which are in reserves at this point in time. But I want to talk about the medicinal plants and the shamans. The shamans are, of course, the medicine men and medicine women who know these plants the best. There's been the argument, well, why do we need indigenous peoples? Because we have high throughput screening. We just go in the rainforest and test everything. But frankly, the shamans, the medicine women and medicine men, are the index of the book, the table of contents of the book, the card catalog of the library, because they're the ones who know how to use these plants. And increasingly we find out how to use these animals, particularly insects, not only which ones have bioactive principles, but the exact dose and how best to prepare them. In the course of a curare, for example, almost all curares are made from at least 2 plants. In the case of ayahuasca that I'll be talking about, I see some heads going like this. In the case of ayahuasca that I'll be talking about, it's almost always made from 2 plants. And what we find are these catalytic reactions. And if you're in a rainforest of 80,000 species of plants, how do you figure out which 2 ones to combine to get the maximum reaction? But time and time again, these indigenous peoples have done that. But just to take a step back, what's the most important medicinal plant in the world? Anybody? The most valuable medicinal plant in the world is the wine grape. $400 billion a year. One species of plant. And here's an interesting aside if you're interested in biological diversity. There are 1,368 varieties of wine known, made from this one species of grape. But today, 80% of our wine comes from 20 varieties. So if you think of 2,000 varieties of wine coming from one species, imagine the possibilities in terms of agricultural products, spices, renewable energy sources, medicines coming from rainforest plants, where, as I said, we're looking at between 40 and 80,000 species of flowering plants in the Amazon alone. But here's why we consider wine to be the ultimate medicine, because in addition to it tasting wonderful and making it more fun and enjoyable to eat a great meal, wine has been used and is still used as a calmative, a soporific, an anesthetic, and an antimicrobial. Now, if you're interested in plants, as all ethnobotanists are, you're also interested in the relationship between the human species and plants. And the best documented relationship is not in the Amazon, which is still full of pre-literate cultures, but in wine. And when I mentioned this to Jane Goodall, who's on the Amazon Conservation Team Board of Advisors, she said, well, you know, wine use did not begin with the human species. Wine use began with other animals. And she said, my chimps use plants for medicinal purposes, and they love to get snockered. In West Africa, there's excellent documentation of animals waiting for the marula fruit to ripen, and in fact over-ripen, and produce alcohol. And here is some of the proof. So clearly, the relationship between animals and plants did not begin in the Amazon and did not begin with the human species. But it's the Amazon which is the greatest terrestrial expression of life on Earth. And there are many, many reasons why conservation is important, but none more so than the Amazon itself. As I said, it's the greatest expression of life on Earth. It's the greatest collection of terrestrial plants. It's the greatest source of promise of new medicines from nature. But in the age of climate change, here's the line I want you to remember from this talk. The battle against climate change cannot be won in the Amazon, but it most certainly can be lost. And let me show you how little we know about the Amazon rainforest. Just 3 years ago, we found a coral reef in the Amazon. It's at the mouth of the Amazon. 2 years ago, we found a cobalt blue tarantula in the northern Amazon. Cobalt blue tarantulas are hard to miss. These are big hongan spiders colored electric blue. Imagine what is still out there. The electric eel from the Amazon has been studied since 1766, when Linnaeus described it. That's 253 years ago. The electric eel is the first encounter with the human species with electricity. If you look at the historical record, it's about torpedo rays in the Nile and in the Mediterranean. The ancient Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians discovered electricity. But the Amazon's been inhabited 11,000 years. So certainly our species was coming across electricity in the Amazon over 10,000 years ago. We tend to think that electricity was discovered by Benjamin Franklin with his kite experiment. But it's these electric creatures that introduced our species to electricity. So here's the news. Last week, we found 2 new species of electric eel in the Amazon. Now, if you look at the historical record, batteries were designed by Volta in part based on his work with the electric eel. Okay, this new species, one of these new species, has 20% greater charge than the previously known species. So imagine this. You have an 8-foot torpedo-shaped tube of meat that's shooting out bolts of electricity, and it was just discovered last week. We're now hoping to design hydrogel batteries for medical implants based on the way this eel works. This is the kapok tree, previously considered the tallest tree in the Amazon. Last week, we found a new species, not a new species, but a well-known species that was 100 meters higher than the tallest known tree. Last week we found the biggest and most powerful species of electric eel. Last week we found the tallest tree in the Amazon. Imagine what's still out there. But the best way to find new and interesting and useful species, the best way to figure out how to protect these forests, the best people to protect these forests are people like these, the indigenous peoples living there, particularly the shamans, the medicine men. As I said at the outset, as Brian said in the introduction, I'm an ethnobotanist, and I've been doing this a long time. I've been working with the indigenous people since the early 80s. This is my friend Kamanya, 1982, and here we are, still working together over 30 years later. I showed this to a friend of mine, and she said, well, I noticed the notebook got bigger in the course of 30 years. And I said, yeah, well, you know, as the size of the brain shrinks, the size of the notebook has to get bigger. But ask any ethnobotanist, and they'll tell you that shamans can sometimes cure things that Western physicians cannot. This was a foot ailment that I had for years, and I walked into the village and the shaman saw me limping, and he said, what's the matter? I said, you got this problem in my foot. Doctor can't fix it. And I'll never forget, he looked me in the face and said, take off your shoe and give me your machete. And I did as I was told, and he went over to a palm tree, scraped off a fern, applied it to my foot, and 8 years later, I'm still fine. Who would you rather be treated by? And it ain't just plants. This is a great shaman, Natala, who I was out collecting with once, and we stopped to take a break. And he took my machete, chopped a piece of dead wood, and all these ants poured out, and he applied it to the inside of his elbow. And they were biting him. And I said, what are you doing? He says, well, it's for my arthritis. And I said, arthritis? I said, use insects for medicinal purposes? He said, yeah, sure. I said, but I asked you when I came here if you used anything besides plants. And he said, you're a plant guy. I don't mind teaching you a few things. You don't know anything about insects. I'm not going to waste my time trying to teach you about that. Here's another example of how they use compounds other than plants for medicinal purposes. This is the magic frog. When my late colleague Lauren McIntyre was lost on the Brazil-Peru border in 1969, he was rescued by a group of Indians who'd never had contact with whites before. They beckoned for him to follow them deeper in the rainforest, which he did. They took out these palm leaf baskets, took out these palm frogs, these giant green monkey frogs from the palm baskets, made cuts in their arm, applied the frog to the cuts, and it turned out to be highly hallucinogenic. Now, you need to know that hallucinogens, entheogens, mind-altering substances are revolutionizing Western medicine. Just last week, Johns Hopkins established a new center with the support of my colleague Tim Ferriss to look at treating incurable diseases like PTSD and depression and schizophrenia using mind-altering substances from the rainforest. Now, as an aside, we told the story of the great Harvard ethnobotanist Richard Schultes in this storybook map. This is put together by Brian. I certainly hope you can invite him back to go further into this incredible retelling of this man's great adventures in the Northwest Amazon. He was a mentor not only to me, but to Melissa's dad, Jock, here as well. And this is a way of using new technologies to tell ancient stories. It's an interactive map, which I encourage all of you to check out to see how we recounted his adventures. This is the man who discovered magic mushrooms. This is the man who discovered ayahuasca. But of course, as Schultes was always quick to point out, ethnobotanists don't really discover anything. They just document what the indigenous peoples tell them. Schultes always emphasized the importance of not just biological diversity, but biocultural diversity. When you walked in his office, over one shoulder was a picture of these Yukuna Indians doing snuff, and over the other was this picture of Chiribiquete, which I'll talk about in a minute. So it's protecting the biological and the cultural at the same time. This is Schultes in a picture from our storybook map, working in the Sibundoy Valley, which Brian has mapped, with the tribe that taught him the use of ayahuasca, which, as I said, is now causing a renaissance in the treatment of certain mental and emotional diseases. Schultes is widely regarded as the founding father of ethnobotany for his collection and writing up the first scientific description of ayahuasca, also known as yahe. Now, I took one of the great ayahuasca shamans of the Northwest Amazon, where it's native, up to Los Angeles to meet a foundation hoping to get some funding to protect the ayahuasca culture, protect the ayahuasca rainforest. And the program officer, who was kind of a jerk, turned to the shaman and said, "I have a question for you. Did you go to medical school?" And the shaman said, "No, I'm a medicine man. I didn't go to medical school." And the guy said, "Well, what could you know about healing?" The shaman smiled, looked at him, and he said, he said, "If you have a cut, go to a doctor. But many human afflictions are diseases of the heart, the mind, and the soul." He said, "Western medicine can't touch those. With ayahuasca, I cure it." Who would you rather be treated by? So ayahuasca has become such a part of the public consciousness and the public culture that it's received the ultimate accolade of public culture in The Onion. Ayahuasca shaman dreading yet another week of guiding tech CEOs to spiritual oneness. So let's talk about how we at the Amazon Conservation Team are using all this information to try and partner with indigenous peoples to protect both the biological and the cultural diversity. And this is the most important picture I'm going to show you this morning. In the top, you see the Xingu rainforest. It's an indigenous reserve in southeastern Brazil. And at the bottom, you see the area outside the Xingu Reserve. So at the top, you have 14 tribes of indigenous peoples. At the bottom, you have white guys. At the top, you have pristine rainforest. At the bottom, you have a bunch of skinny-ass cows. Not a single tree. And in a similar view, indigenous peoples in rainforest, top left, white guys and soy plantation on the bottom right. And I don't know about you, but I'm not really ready to sacrifice turning the world into a warmer place and seeing potential cures for cancer and other so-called incurable diseases go up in smoke so we can produce more tofu, like you see at the bottom. This is a quick resume, a summation of what we've been able to achieve in 25 years at the Amazon Conservation Team. Because when we started up, the big organizations you all know, like World Wildlife Fund and Nature Conservancy, were focused on protecting biological diversity in rainforests. But I saw that nobody was working with the indigenous peoples to protect their culture or their rainforest. And the idea wasn't to do it for them, the idea was to partner with them. And to date, we've partnered with over 100 tribes. We've mapped and improved management and protection of over 80 million acres of ancestral rainforests. And this shows the scope of work. The most important thing is that we focus on the northern Amazon, particularly the Northwest, headquartered in Colombia, and the Northeast, headquartered in Suriname. And that has been the focus of operations and where many of our successes have taken place. This sums up our approach, which is not just about people and not just about plants and animals, but it's land, forest, human rights, water quality, women's empowerment, sustainable livelihoods. This is just the tip of the iceberg of the approach we've had to take. In terms of strategic directions, you're looking at land, livelihoods, and governance, a very unsexy way to put the focus of our work. We've mapped all over the Amazon. We started in the Northeast Amazon with the trios that Brian mentioned in the introduction. We focus very heavily in northwestern South America, not just in the Amazon, but some of the Kogi peoples that I'll talk about in a minute. Interestingly enough, we started partnering with Google Earth, with Rebecca Moore, in the Southwest Amazon about 15 years ago. And we focused mapping efforts in the Southeast, in the Xingu, where I showed you where just outside of the Amazon there's nothing left but soy fields. This has become one of our signature efforts. And when the indigenous peoples asked us to help them, we said yes. And when they asked us to map their lands, we said no. And the chief of the trio said, "Well, how are you going to help us if you're not going to make a map?" I said, "We're going to do something more important, which is going to teach you to make your own map." So this is the perfect marriage of ancient shamanic wisdom and 21st century Western know-how, some of which has been pioneered right here by you folks at Google. This is my friend Muta that I've been working with since 1982. Muta made the first indigenous map of the Northeast Amazon with a piece of butcher paper and a mark slot. We trained him how to do the mapping, and this you see here is our first map in the Northeast Amazon, made by the indigenous peoples themselves in partnership with the government, which again has created an important alliance that didn't exist before. And here you see Rebecca Moore of Google Earth partnering with one of the Surui peoples in our initial effort in partnership with you guys in the Southwest Amazon. Of course, the question is, if you can do this successfully with indigenous peoples, which we knew we could, can you move it to other tribes in the Amazon, which we did successfully? Could you move it to tribes outside the Amazon? And this is coastal Colombia, the famous Kogi peoples who have been called the Dalai Lamas of South America. They're the most traditional peoples in the Western Hemisphere, with the exception of the uncontacted peoples. They still dress traditionally, they still live traditionally. And Brian has spearheaded much of this work in partnership with the Kogis, who live from the Caribbean beach all the way to the snow-capped mountains, the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, primarily between 500 and 200 meters, where they move up and down, which makes them experts at dealing with climate change, because they understand how to utilize the altitudinal gradients to adapt to a change in climate. If you look carefully, I call this our ACT Where's Waldo photo. Actually, Brian is there in the midst of his Kogi mapping team. So one of the interesting we've been able to do is map sacred sites, because these people climb to the sacred lakes high in the Sierra Nevada and then bring offerings down to the seashore. And so it's not just a question of making a bow and arrow map where you put the name of the river and the name of the village, but mapping their shamanic landscapes, which are invisible to our Western eyes. And they decide what goes on the map, they decide what doesn't go on the map. For example, I was out hunting with one of my YY colleagues, and I looked down and the creek sparkled with gold. And I said, "Is that what I think it is?" He said, "Yep." I said, "We're not putting that on the map, are we?" He said, "Nope." Ultimately, the decision is theirs. And as I said, much of our work is about building unlikely alliances. How many people know what Maroons are in the Northeast Amazon? Maroons are the descendants of escaped slaves. These are people who were brought to the Amazon 300 years ago. They got off the slave ships and said, "Hey, equatorial rainforest, see you white boys later." And they ran off in the interior, where they maintain West African tribal lifestyles. Well, on the left, you see my buddy Ken of the YY tribe teaching the trios how to do this ethnographic mapping. And on the right, you see Ken with a Matawai Maroon woman teaching her to make her own map of her own tribal lands. And I dearly love this picture, because this is our Northeast Amazon director, Minu, teaching the Matawai women how to map. So here's Minu, the descendant of Hindustani refugees brought to the Northeast Amazon, teaching descendants of escaped slaves from Africa in the middle of the South American rainforest. And one of the things we found is that women map a different landscape, because in tribal cultures, women tend to focus on the agricultural plots, whereas the men tend to focus on the hunting. So by working with men and women, we're mapping different landscapes and putting them together in the map. And this is Rudo Kemper, another one of our cartographers, working with the elder of the Matawai tribe to document their knowledge of the landscape. And we were actually able to find the first campsite established by the first Maroon when he escaped from slavery. And we're incorporating this under the rubric of Terra Stories. Terra Stories is a storytelling app. It's built to enable these tribal communities to locate and map their own storytelling traditions about places of meaning or value to them. So sometimes it's an agricultural plot, sometimes it's a place of mythological origin or a sacred site. The interface consists of an interactive map and a sidebar, as you see on the left here, with media content. So users can explore the map and click on activated points on the map to see the stories or the video, the interviews associated with these points. The maps are already being used in village schools to teach history, ecology, and build pride in their culture. So in other words, not all the stuff they're looking at has to do with car races or stuff blowing up. They can see their own culture, which provides added value. And this is an open source software that's being developed by a group of volunteer coders, and we are looking for help to continue developing the app. So if you guys want to get involved, let us know when I finish this presentation. And finally, I want to focus on isolated and uncontacted tribes. Uncontacted tribes hold a mystical and iconic role in our imagination. These are the people that know nature best. These are the people that ultimately live off the grid as much as is possible. And these are the people that live in total harmony with nature. We estimate there are about 70 isolated tribes, most of which, as I said, are in the northwest Amazon. Now, why are they isolated? They know the outside world exists. I've interviewed some of the people who came out of isolation, and they said as soon as planes came over in the 40s and 50s, we knew that the outside world exists. But with the advent of Western diseases in 1492, and with the advent of the rubber trade in the northwest Amazon, the infamous Casa Arana, headed up by one of the most evil people in Western history, Julio Arana, on the left, where Indians were enslaved, tortured, mutilated, massacred in search of white rubber, in search of money. They fled into the rainforest and they remain there still. So it's a form of resistance that they have stayed in the rainforest and shunned contact with the outside world. And it used to be that you didn't mess with isolated people. They wanted to be left alone, and here's why. Now, this looks like it was taken in a Brazilian airplane hangar in the western Amazon, but actually and ironically, this is an art exhibit in Havana, Cuba. This is an artist's perception of why you don't mess with isolated peoples. But it's no laughing matter because the outside world is pressing in from all sides on these isolated tribes. Now, we're able to use this remote mapping to find these people and to leave them alone, but to find them and enact protection. So through this detailed aerial mapping, with the help of Google, with the help of Digital Globe, we're able to map this in detail over time. We can look at their zones of use over time to know how much land they need and to see what incursions might be happening or threatening to happen. And then that allows us to better protect them. But how do you, this is like, you know, that Flannery O'Connor story about the Church of Jesus without Jesus. How do you protect uncontacted peoples when you don't want to contact them? So we've gone about this in several ways. One of these is historical records. Going all the way back to the conquest, we know who most of these people are. We know what language or what language family they speak. The secret sauce is we work with the contacted tribes because there's tribes around them that know about these people, that know who they are, why they want to be isolated, and figure out how best to protect them and enlist their aid in protecting their indigenous brothers and sisters. We have successfully helped build guard posts at point of entry, like the mouth of rivers, to keep the outside world at bay. We have created indigenous park rangers, Amazon conservation rangers. And I have a problem with people that fly into these areas, you know, hand the chief a drone, take a picture and put it on their website. This has been running for more than a decade. This is proof of concept. Because of our monitoring, we know about gold mining barges that have encroached into these areas, and we've worked successfully in the case of the Colombian military to chase them out. In some cases, they had to blow them up after a warning, just to get them away from these indigenous peoples. So I want to finish this morning with the tales of my mentor, Richard Schultes, that I mentioned earlier. This is Schultes in Chiribiquete National Park, which wasn't a national park when he first came in there in the 40s. This is Schultes seated near the Cerro de Campana, the Bell Mountain. Now look at the crack over his right shoulder. And this is a picture of the same area I took on a small single engine plane a few years ago. You can see the same crack in the Big Bell Mountain there to the left. And Schultes worked for 40 years with his Colombian colleagues to have this established as a national park. It finally happened in the 80s. And it's the most spectacular landscape in the Amazon, filled with these lost world mountains. It's also home to 3 tribes of isolated peoples. It's also a treasure trove of biological diversity. It's also home to the biggest collection of pre-Columbian paintings ever documented, thousands and thousands and thousands of pre-Columbian paintings. And let me show you what we've been doing to help protect this area. So as I said, Schultes, with his Colombian colleagues, set it up as a national park. That's the green core area in the mid-80s. And we have been working with our Colombian colleagues, not just the government, but the local indigenous tribes, the contacted tribes, to expand this. So here you see the expansion done to the southeast, which is actually indigenous area to provide a buffer so bad guys can't get in there and make a mess of things with gold mining or deforestation. And here you see even more recent expansion to protect the people, the forest, the plants, the animals, the paintings, the uncontacted tribes. And this is a ceremony in Bogota. That's the Colombian president, President Santos, very proudly holding up the proclamation he just signed. That's Minister Murillo, the African-American Minister of the Environment. On the other side is Carolina Gil, our director of the Northwest Amazon Program, and standing next to the president is Liliana Madrigal, who is our vice president and co-founder, to enact this decree. So what does it have to do with us? Where's this? Anybody recognize this photo? Napa. You worried about fires in the Amazon? You should. You should also be worrying about fires in the Arctic. You should also be worrying about fires in Napa. It's all the same thing. The wine industry is $40 billion a year in the US, and it's threatened by climate change. And what you need to know and remember about climate change is that the number 2 cause of carbon being released into the atmosphere is forest destruction. And most of that is taking place in the tropics. So we need to worry about the fate of these indigenous peoples. We need to worry about the fate of these uncontacted peoples in these forests. First and foremost, we need to worry about it because it's the right thing to do. Conservation, first and foremost, is an ethical exercise, in my opinion. It's not about new treatments for cancer. It's not about new treatments for depression. It's not about new biodegradable pesticides. It's the right thing to do. The second reason we need to worry about conservation abroad and at home, it's in our own interest to do so. We all need new medicines. We all need new agricultural products. We all need new biodegradable products. We all need clean air and clean water. I firmly believe that the fate of these people and their forests is our fate as well. Thank you again. Again, I want to thank everybody for inviting us here, especially Melissa for midwifing this visit. We have had a partnership with Google for many years. It's been very valuable to us on many fronts. And I'm here to say we want to continue that partnership, that we know that we can't do it ourselves. We know the indigenous peoples can't do it ourselves. And by building these types of unusual alliances, it makes all of us more powerful. We took one of the paramount shamans of the Kogis to Google HQ in California and said, you speak. We want them to hear from you. And when he gave this beautiful speech, which I think is on YouTube, at the end I said, now you can ask him anything you want. And I'll never forget the first question. Somebody raised their hand and said, what do you think of Google? And he looked at them and said, everything here is very square because the Kogis build round houses. So I don't think that was the answer they were expecting, but it's quite unforgettable in its own right. Now I'm going to ask Brian and Isadora to join me because we're here as a team, and we invite any questions you might have. And you know, sometimes a question occurs to you later, but I want to encourage this free flow of information. We have a very bright bunch of people here. I know by virtue of the fact, based on where we are, that you may have ideas or approaches that we don't have. And I said, we're looking for help with some of this coding, some of this program. You know, when you're in the not-for-profit world, it's the opposite of the for-profit world. For-profit world, you're trying to build a better mousetrap and put it in a black box. That's your competitive advantage. But for us, it's just the opposite. We want to build these tools and have them used far and wide, because the whole point of this is to protect this biocultural diversity. Does anybody have any questions?
You're doing a lot for the Amazon, which is tremendous, and more people should join the initiative. I was wondering what you're doing for other untouched masses of land, like for instance, Mayana or some of the areas in Africa. Are we going there and trying to save them before governments and people start to butcher that land as well? or is it just the Amazon?
Why don't you speak to that first?
Sure. So, yeah, you're absolutely right that the protection of some of these other intact ecosystems in other part of the world is vital. Our focus as an organization is on, it started in the Amazon. We've since expanded to other areas, mostly in Colombia. We're currently working in Antioquia and the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta and the Caribbean coast, which are our two major work areas outside of the Amazon. So for us, we're focused on South America and always partnering with indigenous communities. I guess the number one criteria are the invitation of the local partners to come in and collaborate on conservation projects with them.
Yeah, we all know the term mission creep, and we set up this organizations to avoid that because there's a lot of demand for our approach, which we're happy to teach people to use. But I don't want to start working in the Sahara or the Sahel or with the pygmies because we have a mission that we're trying to focus on. So we kind of fudge a little bit by working with other tribes, as Brian said, some of the work with the Kogis. But all primary forests everywhere need to be treated as our seed capital. If you guys haven't been to northern New York State and seen those forests protecting those reservoirs, you should, and it's obviously in everybody's interest to protect that.
One thing to mention, we are designing the Terra Stories application to be usable by communities throughout the world. So it's being designed to be adaptable to any kind of languages or things like that. So we do see that platform as having potential uses with other tribal peoples across the world to help protect some of their traditional knowledge. So I think that's one way where some of the same methodology can be carried over to other parts of the world.
So you talk a lot about your collaborations with the Colombian government, which is amazing. I wanted to know what, if anything, you've been doing with the Brazilian government as well.
Okay. I'm going to turn the Colombian question over to Isidoro, who is Colombian. But we always try to build alliances and work with people where possible. Now, there's no hard and fast rule. For example, we're partnering with the church in Suriname to fight the jaguar trade, and we're fighting with the church in Colombia over some treatment of some indigenous peoples. So we look for alliances where we can, but you have to be nimble and flexible. And before I turn over to him on Colombia, I'm meeting...
Sorry, my question was specific about Brazilian government?
Yes, I'm meeting with the Brazilian Minister of the Environment next week. This is not a natural ally, but I'm open to a free and fair exchange of views. So it remains to be seen what is possible in Brazil. I'm not overly optimistic, but I'm hopeful. Let me put it that way. But why don't you talk about Colombia?
Thank you.
Well, also with regards to Brazil, I think the issue is key. The issue that is key is allying oneself with subnational governments and technical agencies. So, for example, with regards to mapping or land rights, we've expanded a lot of our capacity and we've become leaders in the region. And therefore, for example, FUNAI and INPE in Brazil as well. So we're building a network there with technical agencies and supporting them. At the political side, with subnational governments, so for example, the state of Pará and Mato Grosso and Acre, Amazonas as well. So I think there's a key opening there with subnational governments rather than the national entity as a whole. And that's what ACT is doing as well, furthering that strategy there. And last but not least, civil servants and bureaucrats. The political leadership moves back and forth, but bureaucrats and civil servants stay there and they build know-how. So that's further an additional focus we're taking on in Brazil as well, supporting local bureaucrats and civil servants, which are also very much threatened by the violence against defenders and with what's happening against environmental defenders in South America and Central America.
This is Colombia?
Yeah, so in Colombia, well, same strategy there. And, we've advanced a lot with about half of the land rights of the lands titled to indigenous groups in Colombia in the last 10 years were thanks to the Amazon Conservation Team.
Thank you guys for coming. Really appreciate it. I had two questions. First is, for everyone in the room that came to see you guys speak, what's the biggest thing that we could do to support what's happening in the Amazon today specifically, and then also the great work you guys are doing generally? Second question, a little more fun. What is the most interesting plant medicine research happening today? And feel free to be liberal with that.
The first thing that needs to be done to protect the type of things I've shown you today is not that different from the first thing that needs to be done right here at home. And that is to know and to care and express your opinion. Conservation never was a political issue. Conservation was started in this country by a Republican, Teddy Roosevelt. The second most important conservation president we ever had was also a Republican. Who was that? Richard Nixon. Endangered Species, Marine Mammal Act. So it was only with the advent of Ronald Reagan that this became politicized and was seen as a Democratic issue, a left-wing issue. I mean, really? Do people not care about clean air and clean water? So voting for people who talk and care about the environment, voting against people who don't, is very important. I always say, you know, work at home, but support stuff overseas. So you can support our efforts. It's easy to do. Our website is amazonteam.org. Like I said, I think we've got a longer-term working partnership with Google than any other rainforest organization. In terms of the most interesting plant medicine, I mean, how long have you got? That's a much longer lecture. I would have to start out with ayahuasca, which is the ultimate plant medicine, or it's not called ayahuasca in many of the areas we work in Colombia. It's called el remedio, the medicine. And it's tremendously exciting to see academia seizing on this and creating this new center based on this. And we were really set back for decades because of the over-sensationalized approach to this that came out of the 60s. But like any medicine, it doesn't have all the answers. But like any good medicine, it's got some of the answers. And I think it's got some very powerful answers. But mind-altering substances, entheogens, that release the God within, are not limited to plants, like I gave the example of the frog, are not limited to amphibians, like I gave the example of the fungi, the magic mushrooms. And I believe that we will be finding more as time goes along. But that's based on two practices. One is protecting that biodiversity, and two is honoring, protecting, and listening to the indigenous peoples who know these things best.
Hi, this is actually a good segue to the question that I had about sustainability. So as we discover these amazing medicines and as they become more well-known and popular, the demand is going to increase. So how do you have recommendations that you make for creating the sustainable practice around those?
Well, first of all, I think it's fundamental to be responsible in consumption and responsible in travel. As you might have heard recently, there is flight shame, issues related to traveling as much and tourism. So I think it's fundamental that, you know, when you're looking at these plants and looking at these medicines as well and trying to go to the root place where they're produced, be really responsible, know where you're consuming them as well. There's issues related to erosion of cultural traditions due to this increasing demand for such types of products. So one of the things is, it's the same as Mark said, is learn and become aware and know where you're going and trying these products.
You know, ironically, ayahuasca is something of a weed. It's quite easy to grow. I've seen it growing wild in Hawaii. That being said, there are some of the shamans that we work with at ACT that complain of seeing plane loads of the stuff being shipped out. So don't think just because you're using something natural, A, it's good for you and can't be harmful, or B, it's sustainable because it grows. So as Isidoro said, the idea of being sustainable consumers, and that means everything from Amazonian hallucinogens to medicinal plants at home. So there's a great learning curve that we all need to be on in terms of making sure that our footprint, carbon and otherwise, on the planet is as small as necessary.
My question is, how much more land do you think we need to set aside? How many more millions of acres till we have a buffer barrier around the most sensitive areas? And one of the things that always fascinated me were within these parks are these regions where species generate at a much faster rate than anywhere in the world. It does not surprise me. When we first went to Suriname, Bosco's father, the primatologist, had discovered 3 new primates, little pygmy monkeys, were they? Or,
Yeah.
so there's so much more out there, and I just wondered how much more do you think? How much more acreage would you like to see? Would you like to see all the parks connected?
Well, E.O. Wilson at Harvard, who's really the preeminent biologist of our time, is calling for 50% of the planet to be left alone, or left in protected areas. Protected areas can be private woodlots, protected areas can be national parks, protected areas can be indigenous reserves. So we have a good working figure. And you know, one of the things I enjoy about New York is to see, in a sense, how many people can live well and comfortably together, which takes the pressure off a lot of ecosystems as long as it's managed well. It doesn't mean that everybody crammed into an urban environment lives healthy and well. I'm sure most of you have been to Mexico City or Rio and see the slums that are more characteristic of the third world than are here. So it's not that simplistic, like just let's get everybody out of the forest and put them in an urban environment. That has to be managed well as well. But there's enough degraded land, there's enough deforested land to produce all the food we need. We should be embarking on a tremendous and aggressive tree planting program around the world. The Ethiopians, I think, have the best record in launching 1 million tree planting in a short period of time. And so protecting a certain amount of areas is very important, but it has to be managed, it has to be protected, and we have to worry about what's going on outside. Tom Lovejoy, famous biologist who's on the board of the Amazon Conservation Team, said all wildlife management is essentially really just people management.
So in terms of number of hectares, I think it's difficult to quantify just due to the scale of the Amazon. You know, this is a rainforest the size of the continental United States. Some of these national parks that exist are the size of states in the United States. You know, so these are huge territories. I think something you mentioned with connectivity is one of the most crucial issues, and we need to be not only creating these protected areas, but also connecting them with protected areas and with indigenous reserves. So this is an initiative that we've really been focusing on, establishing corridors of conservation in the Andean Amazon area, and also extending that down into lowland Amazonia. So we need to start establishing these large-scale ecological connections so that as climate change starts impacting the ecosystem, that species are going to be able to move around and adapt to the conditions. And this idea of connectivity, it can't be done just by drawing it on the map, you know, circling protected areas, but it needs to be done at a grassroots level of working with communities, you know, working with them to help them manage their lands, plan their lands so that they're able to connect the forest patches on their lands and create these large-scale linkages, but building it from the ground level and rolling it up, not the other way of top-down corridors. That's kind of how we see it as, you know, creating some pristine protected areas, but then empowering all the communities around the outside so that these areas can be better protected.
So thank you all once again. Thanks to Melissa. We look forward to continuing our collaboration with Google. Thanks again.